Alright folks, this is the Fat Man GM in my poorly lighted work truck. Got some light from the Hana ramen sushi joint that I'm fixing to clean here in about 20 minutes or so. Some light from the parking lot, work lights, blah blah blah. It could be better, it could always be better, right? I tried to do, this would be my third attempt at this. The first one didn't go off so well. The second one had no sound. I've done some test checks. This should have sound, just poor lighting, right? Okay. Another reason for militarizing Starfleet. I'm a big advocate of Star Trek, or of the Federation having at least a small percentage of dedicated, prepared, trained, and purposely built warships for the occasional need of putting a shield between themselves and an aggressive foe. Now the argument is, and I'll laud the Federation for having the strength of wisdom and of the, and I'm struggling for the word that I want, the fortitude to stick to their philosophy on things of this plow to the swords to plowshares, plowshares to swords philosophy that they've pursued since the earliest days. The idea being is Starfleet's primary goal and purpose in existence is to explore and to meet new and interesting peoples and to promote diplomacy and the advantages of the Federation to the foes around them. And this was more so the more we get into the timelines of the series, the more that holds true to a point. Now, based off of most of my revisitations of the Facet role-playing game system, which was predominantly based off of the original TV series, to a limited degree the Next Generation, and to the movies that gapped in between, especially the ones with the original crew, the galaxy was a much wilder and wider place. Much less was known than, say, a century later. And by the time we get to the DS9 and Voyager, pretty much the Federation has experienced all four of the major quadrants of the galaxy, have traveled to the far corners, have yet to explore every inch of it, I grant you. There's so much unknown yet to be explored. But we've encountered some pretty potent foes pretty much everywhere the Federation has gone. So, it's a given that even from the earliest days that the starships were armed, they have shielding. This is constantly being improved upon and added to over time because of these conflicts and these both minor conflicts and major confrontations, major war. And we see this time and time again, regardless which canon you choose to pick. Even the Kelvin canon, which I guess is the reboot of the original Star Trek Captain Kirk series. I've liked the movies. I've enjoyed them. I was a little fuzzy on the time crossover in this new Star Trek universe per se, but not opposed to it as I would be the issues with stuff in Star Wars where Disney and the creators are just trying to basically run ramshot over this thick, heavy canon established by Lucas and Lucasfilms and that I grew up on. Well, in Star Trek, we're a bit more familiar with the change. You know, maybe not to the extreme that you see in Marvel Comics and such, where it seems like every couple of years we see a brand new version of Peter Parker and Spider-Man, because it can never get more than 2 or 3 movies before either the actor's age is out or they seem to run out of movie-related material, which was strange considering how many comic books were produced. But that's neither here nor there. So, we know that the Federation does produce a wide range of ships. The lion's share of them in the mid-range of size and capacity. We see a lot of what would be considered destroyers and light cruisers, scout ships, some exploration ships, some patrol ships. Then we see the upper category, the heavy ships, the heavy cruisers, what would be considered battleships if we're going in that type of line of progress. A Galaxy class heavy cruiser is by all means a battleship in anybody's vernacular when you compare it to the other scale of ships. It's much more bigger, it's generally more robust and carries more, bigger, has more firepower and more shielding. On the other side, it carries many more civilian and non-military types on board, and is more susceptible to heavier firepower from equivalent sized ships of opposing forces. Now, this in the time of conflict. First, we look in modern times. First, the Borg and the Borg conflict, and then the skirmishing between the Klingons and the Federation, and that kind of whizzled in and out. The conflict between the Federation and the Cardassians, then the Dominion War, and of course, like I said, the Borg spread all through this, and especially the Dominion War, we saw the Federation on the ropes. It was in a very desperate situation, and to some degree had to resort to some very un-Federation-like tactics to win. Genocide against the Borg, genocide against the Jem'Hadar. You can argue all day long that that's not what was going on, but even Captain Sisko had a moment where he put out his regrets and then asked himself, or said to himself, would I do this again? You betcha I would. That's because he's a different caliber than, say, Picard. But even the Picard stood up to the Borg, and the question is whether or not did he help genocide them or not. He did not at least take the wind out of their sails and diminish them as a threat to the bulk of the Federation known galaxy, so to speak. So, time and time again, the Federation, which its tenets is exploration, diplomacy, first contact, which is awesome. Lots of scientific research going on. A lot of these vessels designed for that in mind. With defense as a second. And that's a key word there, defense. Not offense, defense, because theoretically, they're not supposed to go on the offensive unless everything else has been tried. And that's fair, because that fits the tenets of the Federation. This fits the model of what Gene Roddenberry envisioned for the Federation. And yet, there's a call for at least a small a small portion of the standing Starfleet to be devoted to the art of war, to developing the sciences of war, exploring the options of tactics and combat, to have purposely trained officers and crews with purposely built and heavily modified for combat action starships, i.e. warships. Now, this fits it reminds me of the adage that President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt had once said, but when he was running for president, speak softly and carry a big stick, right? So, the Federation has this speak softly and palm forward gestures of friendship to within the tenets of the Articles of Federation and the Starfleet's operational commands. At the same time, we know that over and over again, the Federation needs to have that big stick. And unfortunately, they have to fall back on the firebreak philosophy to some degree, follow some of the early Russian combat mentality of the 18th and 19th century, where we give ground to the enemy until the enemy wears itself out and we have a chance to build up our offensive capability, and then we grind forward and grind them down. Well, that's fine to a certain degree, but the Dominion showed the ability to outproduce ships, and more importantly, outproduce the Jem'Hadar, which crewed those ships for the most part. And the Federation, it takes longer to train Federation crews. It may not take as long to build ships, but it sure takes longer to build crew, or to build, train crews. So the fact was they come upon a point in time when they had not enough, they had plenty of ship capacity, but not enough people to crew them, and not to keep up with the attrition rates that was going on. The Dominion was grinding the Federation down, not the other way around. And we saw in battle after battle after battle, the Starfleet throw these lightly armored, lightly shielded, lightly armed, sometimes hastily upgraded exploration vessels and science vessels into the front lines, where we watched them get obliterated and suck up damage for the more potent, heavier ships to take home and deliver a punch. And thousands and thousands and thousands of Starfleet personnel and officers died, and some of them unnecessarily. Some because they were fighting in the wrong kind of ships that were poorly equipped for the level of combat they were involved in. Sometimes because a lot of their captains and their command crews are not combat trained officers. That is not what they do. They're science, and they're explorers, and they're diplomats, and then defenders. And no defender is worth two aggressors. The truth is, if you spend most of your time training to fight on the other guy's ground and putting the other guy on his heels, you're going to likely beat them more often than you're going to lose. And that's a historical fact. I don't make up that stuff. So I believe that there's a good reason to have even if it's just 5% of, or 10% or 5% of the Starfleet's active capability, and another 10 or 15% of mothball capability, of reserved capability, where you have these ready warships, ready built, ready to fight, put into the front, hit the enemy in hard, perhaps in hit and run and strike, and keep them on the defensive as much as on the offensive as possible, to give the home front time to crank out those warships and to upgrade those exploration ships into something that can stand a chance against purposely built warships. Because what did we see? The Klingons build warships, right? The Romulans build warships. Yeah, they all do exploration. The Klingons have their version. The Romulans do a lot more of it, but they still build warship first, usually, generally. They build more warships than they do exploration vessels. And then the Dominion, that's pretty much all they built. The Jem'Hadar fielded nothing but the Jem'Hadar fighter, the Jem'Hadar battleships, the warships that were purposely built and designed to fight and defeat an enemy. Better shielded, heavily armored, better armed, more heavily armed. It just over and over and over again, one-on-one, they were very few Federation vessels that could stand up to their foes, or at least win a draw. And this is not acceptable, not sustainable in a truly large conflict. It is something that doesn't work well. Now, because I'm promoting for a role-playing game, this was one of the issues that I ran into when I was younger, and my friends and associates, when we first started seeing the Star Trek, fastest version of Star Trek, the role-playing game. It promoted more science and exploration and problem solving, like the original TV series did, but frankly, most of us found it boring. We're not intellectual types. We're not those brainiacs who thrive on this sort of thing. There were a few that could handle got into it, and we worked at it, but we're more of the hands-on action adventure, which is where Star Wars suited us better than Star Trek's basic underlining theme. One of the ways that I was successful at combating that was to allow the fact that the Federation should have a small percentage of warships dedicated to keeping the peace and being the big stick. And so the member players of our group then became partners in that sort of scenario, and it worked to the enjoyment of the group. That was my thought on that subject. So, by all means, the Federation is not doing its members justice by not having better prepared defenses and having a permanently established offensive capability, purposely built, designed, and trained to do that. So, Can you imagine the scenario? And it doesn't always play well in the TV series and the movies, but in my mind it does. Where the not so quite Captain Picard or not so quite Captain Kirk of the Federation find themselves confronted by a much more potent foe, and they're on the defensive. They're trying to find everything they can to find a peaceful solution to what's going to be a very ugly end, and in the process they put in a call for backup, and in the nick of time, the tradition of the cavalry arriving at the last second, out of warp drops a handful of dedicated warships, perhaps crewed, led by a heavy cruiser or a battleship that's truly designed to do to fulfill that role. And the captain looks to his foe and says, meet our pit bulls, or meet the big stick. Lo and behold, perhaps, just perhaps, some of those more aggressive alien races will think twice before openly, blatantly attacking the Federation wholesale. And for the regular enemy that we know exists, that might have signed that peace treaty and agreed to no longer pursue combat situations, that there's a deterrent. They know they're going to come up against the Blue Fleet or the Black Fleet or the Big Stick at some point. And if you want to cross that border and start trouble, the Enterprise is there to try to dissuade you otherwise. And then when that fails, they step aside and let the stalwart come in and beat the snot out of them. My thought on that subject, my 2 cents. From the Fat Man to you, from Hannah Sushi, have a good night and game on.